Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Soulful Revolution, a podcast at the intersection of spiritual transformation and social change. I'm your host, Lauren Grubau-Thomas, a priest, writer, spouse, and twin mama living on Arapaho and Cheyenne homelands in what's commonly known as Littleton, Colorado. My guest today is Eréndira Jimenez Esquinca, who is coming to us with an incredible array of wisdom and experience. She's a spiritual director, financial advisor, world-building companion, and artist. They've been engaged in spirit work for the past 20 years and accompanying folks on their decolonizing, transformation, and liberation journeys for the last 4 years. Eréndira, it's so good to have you on the show today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for the invitation. So happy to join you.
Well, I want to begin with a question I pose to all of my guests about what it means to you to be a soulful revolutionary, someone poised at this intersection of spiritual transformation and social change.
That's a good question. It's funny, this question coming at this point in my life with a baby. I got a new baby. She's 9 months and like 2 days, and just kind of reflecting on my late 30s. I think for me, like revolutionary, I felt very active, like in my late 20s, early 30s, like very passionate, very fiery, very like burn it all down. It was good. It was like I had to get all that rage out, you know. But I like that pairing of like soulful. For me, just feels like peaceful, quiet, and revolutionary. Doesn't feel as maybe active isn't the right word, activating. There's something about it right now that feels like gentle, like a gentle invitation into like newness. That's kind of where that's landing for me today.
A gentle invitation to newness. I really like that. You alluded to one of the new seasons that you find yourself in as a mother. And in your bio, you talk about how you're also in this new season as a financial advisor. And so I'm curious to hear, I resonate. I'll start by saying that. I so resonate with starting all the new things at once. I had my daughters. Right. I left established church ministry to be able to launch a new community and to really set out on this writing vocation journey. And there's something about having a baby, or in my case too, that like seems to catalyze an openness to new experiences. I don't know if that resonates with you.
It was like, you know, I'd had a really interesting pregnancy where like I feel like I did a lot of that kind of void work, like as you're transitioning from like being just you to being a you with like another attached to you. Like it's such a disorienting experience. And I think for some pregnant people, it happens like during pregnancy, and for some it happens like post-pregnancy, like once that new parenthood happens. But for me, it really came like in pregnancy, and I was like in the void, and the void is just like floating, like nothing makes sense. Like down is up is down. And so when my baby was born and I came out on the other side, I think I had already kind of worked through a lot of that, like that shifting that happens. And so I was like, all right, like I feel like I know who I am and I'm ready for this like next chapter. And then it was kind of like, how do you integrate like the self that exists, I guess, like in the world, and then that like self that kind of exists in like the small cocoon of home. And it was like I'm the kind of person that I need both. And I was like, okay, I'm like getting my bearings as a new parent, as a new mama, and like now I need to figure out what this means for my life work. And the reality is also like it's expensive.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's like expensive. It's expensive to bring new things into the world. Like because of the way that I think like our economic systems are set up, like we don't really live in ways that are that create a lot of ease for like newness. I think that's maybe also part of like the birthing of new things. Like there is like pain involved. But I also think that like because of the system that we live in, we need to be resourced in certain ways in order to be able to support new things. And I was like at a place with my work where I was like, I'm not like being very well resourced, not that the people that I was working with weren't resourcing me, but I just was like, I didn't have enough to be able to support her, and like her growing and her becoming. And so I was like, I gotta find something new. And I happened, like a mentor of mine had pivoted into financial services as well. And I've been listening to their journey for a while and was like, oh, there's like some new systems of like working with money and wealth. And I'm really curious about that. So for me, it actually is still a little bit of an exploration. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, that newness happening simultaneously is like, I don't know any other way.
Yeah.
Just like throw it all on. Like, let's just throw the self into as much of that catalytic change as possible.
I've been thinking a lot about labor pains in terms of the way that movements work in the world, and that we find ourselves at this moment right now that's really agonizing, and there's a lot of unknown on the other side. And I hear in the work that you do, you bring this sense of deep spiritual attention to questions and to the unknown within like individuals' lives, as well as like looking at the collective, looking at the big picture. And so I'm curious about like, just as you look at I want to circle back to, your coming into this space as a financial advisor, but I want to get there by looking at the big picture, and invite you to reflect on kind of where do you see us right now in terms of being on the threshold of something new, and what it means for those of us who are trying to midwife that, as we're taking on new skills, as I hear that you are doing. Like, yeah, speak to the midwives among us about what does it look like to live in this threshold space as people who are really trusting that these are labor pains, and that we're on the other side of something else. What does that look like for you?
Honestly, it is really it's a little bit disorienting right now. A lot of the work that I do, like not with like the wealth advising stuff, but with my other business, Spirit School, is kind of watching like shifts in spiritual landscape and like language that's being used around like identity and belonging and purpose. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that like the same language is being used by people who maybe have different values. And so it's like a really interesting like blurring where you're like, oh, I don't quite know who my people are,
Yeah.
I will say that one of the things that is bringing up with me is my own kind of awareness of like how I still operate in like a binary way of like, oh, those people are good, these people are bad, like these people are out, these people are in, and so it really is kind of like pushing a little bit on my my value of like non-dualism, right? Of like the both and, that all of these things can like coexist, and that's part of like a dynamic like system, an environment. And like it's really hard to know like what, I don't know if I want to use the word integrity, but it feels like I don't always know like what I can trust. And so I think that feels like something that is true for maybe those of us who are midwifing, is like I feel like the impulse to mistrust is really strong. To wonder about like, the shadow side of people's stories, and like maybe even stick people in those. I don't know. I'm thinking about like a couple of different communities that I'm on the fringes of where I'm like, oh, I don't actually know what you believe. I don't know. You say some things and we use some of the same words over here, but then you use some different words over here. And so does that mean that we can be a community together or not? And I think I'm wondering, like, maybe that's not the right question to be asking. Because I think, wondering if I can be in community with you is kind of stepping into that like binary way of kind of interacting and being with the world where it's like, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like, right now, I think those of us that are midwifing are being invited to a lot of discernment around like language that it's being used and like who's using it and why it's there. And
the image that's coming up for me as you're sharing is birthing imagery. So I'm just going to stay there for a second because the image that comes up is like when my twins were born. One of my girls was born head first, and the other, once her sister exited, her sister flipped and had to be pulled out by the ankle, had to be pulled out breech. And I spoke in the aftermath of a very painful delivery of the second twin. The next day I spoke with the nurse midwife who said to me that she had delivered twins before, but never on her own. And that she was so relieved when the doctor stepped into the room and snapped her gloves on and said, "Let's meet these twins." Because there was a moment there, like my girls came so fast that there was a moment there where the nurse midwife thought she'd be doing it by herself. And the doctor, who was like this like superwoman walking into the room with this calm that she brought into the space, she knew how to deliver my second daughter breech to pull her out by the ankle when everyone else actually thought that she was still vertex. And I tell that story because I'm curious about the kinds of training that we might need in this season that we don't yet have. The kinds of gifts that perhaps the gifts that we do have, but we haven't honed and we haven't worked to finesse and to strengthen within ourselves. And that we have the capacity to exercise these muscles. Like, this nurse midwife, I'm sure she could have delivered both girls successfully. Like, she would have been okay. But the doctor had the practice to be able to know exactly what to do in that situation. And you stepping into this, so here's the connection. Stepping into this like financial advisor role might seem counterintuitive for some people who would see your history as a spiritual companion and go, wow, money, that seems like a really different skill set to be using. But I hear, and this is what I'm curious to hear you explore and like make the connections for us in terms of, the value you see, because I hear you saying like, no, these things are actually deeply connected, and these are skills that we all need to be able to have a smooth birth, to be able to like welcome whatever is wanting to be born. And that we're going to need all the tools that are at our disposal and all the gifts. And this is simply one that you hadn't previously exercised that you're now like leaning into.
Yeah. No, I love it. I'm going to follow up your birth story with my birth
Go
story.
for it.
Because my baby, oh my gosh, I won't get into the details, but she was born face presenting, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it is really rare as well. So she came like face first, like nose first. Yes, and also like one of those kinds of births that is like makes a lot of people nervous, let's just say. But I say that because I think what we're going to be seeing is like more of these kind of unusual births becoming more common, right? And so I think like, and I'm using that like metaphorically, but I think the things that are going to start popping up, that we'd be like, oh, well, that's just like, that's a fluke, right? Like I think the flukes are maybe going to start becoming the norm. And I say that both in the sides of like like injustice, like the things that are like evil and, like destructive and oppressive and harmful. Like I think it's easy to be like, well, that's just like over there. Like that's just happened because of this like one stream of events leading up to this. But I think they're going to start becoming more normal. But I also think that on the flip side, like these new birthings of like new worlds that are about justice and love and connection and solidarity, like those also have the potential to become more and more normal, right? Like they're not going to be like one-offs that, just happen every like movements that happen every like 50 years. Like those movements can start to happen more and more and more. So I think what we're seeing is that like time is maybe speeding up in some regards. Like things that took longer to happen 100 years ago are going to start compounding and happening faster.
Like a shorter gestation.
Now. I think so. And I think the ways that they're going to pop up are going to be like a little bit like, oh, that is not how I was expecting that to happen. Like I'm used to things popping up in this way, like birthings happening in like a very, traditional way. And so we're going to see things that are maybe less traditional. So that being said, I think that you're right. Like we need different kinds of tools to meet the unexpected. The material world is like uncomfortable for me, like you shared at the beginning. I've spent most of my life like in ministry, in spiritual spaces, in church work, in spiritual direction. Like I have often like lived in what we might call like the ether, right? Like the abstract, that's the ineffable when it comes to like spirit and the divine, knowing that like it needed to be grounded, like knowing that it is grounded, right? Like we can't have contemplation without action. And I don't know if I really knew how to be in relationship with like something as tangible as money. Like, I don't know about you, but I had a lot of like really not so great like money stories. I really kind of internalized that like money is evil. And that, it was like dirty, and that like wanting things was like, was bad, that, and it made me a bad person. It made me a sinner. Just, the narratives that I was kind of given as a young person. And so I think right now is like kind of reforming our relationship to materiality feels really important. My kind of like slogan for my financial advising business is like, it's called Portal. So it's like where the spiritual and material meet. And I really think that when we like come into this space where we're like, we can invite both the spiritual and the material, it's like, it opens us up into the unexpected and into like transformative work. I work with a lot of folks that are trying to start new things, like church planters, spiritual entrepreneurs, and I'm one as well. And I just know that if you're not resourced financially, like burnout is just around the corner. We need money in this like day and age. Like it's just part of the way that we have chosen to be in relationship with one another. That's the way that we exchange. That's how we exchange things with one another. And so like money is an inevitability, I suppose. And so knowing how to like handle, hold, receive, let go, trade, kind of like being in those, like the energetics of like that exchange is super important, and is still something that I'm like trying to figure out how to do it in a way that doesn't lean us towards like the shadow side of like money, which is distorted power.
You've evoked for me an experience I had in high school where I was prompted to write an essay arguing for or against the claim that money is the root of all evil. And I got the prompt, and I remember this gut instinct of the harder way to write this would be that it's not. And that like deep down, I didn't believe that money was the root of all evil. But I was like, the easier way to write this essay is that it is the root of all evil. Yeah. And I wrote the essay, and of course, like it wasn't as good of an essay because it's much deeper to make the non-binary case
Right.
being human is messier than that. And that money, as a tool, as one of the like you were describing, the ways that we mediate relationship is something that's that could be an expression of that. But it's so easy to like live in that binary of I'm just not gonna mess with it. And it's so messy to live in that portal space that you're describing of mediating the material and the spiritual.
I really think, like you ask about tools, and it's like, I think we just have to learn how to become really comfortable in the void. Like we have to learn to be really uncomfortable in the portal, like in the space between, in the liminality. Like I deeply hope that like myself and like our generation like gets to see what's on the other side. And I'm not sure that we will, I think that there's something about our generation that like we're a hinge generation. We're kind of a bridge. We're bringing the new world out of the old, and so we have to learn how to not know, and how to be okay with not knowing, and how to be okay with like, when I was pregnant, I had this image of like that was just like floating on an ocean, and there was just like nothing. There was nothing. There was no ship. There was no island. It was just like me in this like vast ocean, and all I could do was like cultivate like the knowing that like this wasn't the end, that something would eventually shift, that the tides would turn. But until then, until like spirit decided to like meet me and like move me, like I just had to surrender to kind of like the space in between. And so I don't, that's not passive, because it was like deeply emotional. Yeah. It was like there was like so much internal stuff that was happening. I had to like unearth all of that in order to be able to like meet myself as a new person on the other side. No one really wants to be uncomfortable, right? I think that's why we see the world the way that it is.
I wonder for you, you mentioned desire, and the things that we want and the way that money mediates that. And I'm curious what role desire plays for you in stepping into this new role and in accompanying folks in terms of wealth.
Oh, that is a good question. There's like still something, I think, deep down in the stories that I was told, in the ways that like I was formed, that like desiring anything other than God, anything other than God is like wrong. And to desire anything in like the material realm was going to pull me out of alignment with like most valuable relationship. This is like old language, not language I would use today, but I think there's still like splinters of that in me. I think what I'm working on embodying is like desire is just human, and like that part of our humanness is beautiful, like to be drawn to like fecundity, to abundance, to be drawn to like yummy food and like beautiful art and lovely people is an expression. It is an expression of the divine. As I'm speaking right now, I'm wondering if I think anything has both like shadow expressions and light expressions, right? And so desire in its shadow is greed. It's extraction. It's exploitation. It's like ravenous. Yeah. And so I think sometimes when I hear desire, I hear those words. And that's not what desire is, I think desire is just like an acknowledgement that there is good things in the world, and that you want to be in relationship with good things. I think that desire to be in oneness with something other than yourself is not a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing, because I think it's actually like it pulls us deeper into connection with one another, with spirit and with ourselves.
oneness that really strikes me. That does, desire to be one and not to be separate. And that the greed stories are stories of separation and of using and exploiting and making things of other beings.
Yeah.
And what does it look like to follow our desires toward connection and toward wholeness and toward abundance for ourselves, for others, for the world? That's helpful. And I'm also remembering, I heard a female comedian whose name is Ilana Glazer. Ilana Glazer had a little video she put out a couple days ago about how she anticipates under the next administration that the kind of production of what we're supposed to desire, like what we're told we should desire, in terms of like art, in terms of political propaganda, etc., is going to be tasteless and tactless and tacky, which is so true. That was so true under the previous time this president was in charge, like just the kind of tactlessness and tackiness. Yeah. And so her encouragement was to cultivate your taste, to enjoy dressing beautifully, to enjoy good food, to seek out good music and art. And I thought, wow, what a lovely way to be preparing our desires for what is good and what is connective, and instead of what separates us.
No, I love that. I you say that, and I think, how can we envision if we don't know what we desire? Like, how can we envision new worlds, new realities? How can we know what we want to build towards if we don't know the things that elicit that joy, that like juiciness, that like connection? So yeah, I absolutely think that like getting in touch with our desire is important. And also knowing that like like desire to vision to building, like that's going to require like a particular kind of resource in order to get there, right? And so we can't just like desire the new world and then kind of like wash our hands of that vision. So it's like once we know what we want, like, and we want to build it, then that's going to require like a material like orientation, I guess, in order to get there.
So that makes me curious about your process when you're accompanying somebody. What does it look like to walk with somebody and to explore that way that desire moves to vision, moves to material expression?
I think it is unique to each person, because I think each person is coming into that relationship with desire in a different place. But I always like to start my time with folks with like some kind of like meditation, silence. As you were talking about like the tactless and the tasteless, I couldn't help but think like the world is just so loud, like we're being bombarded constantly, left, right, up, down, with like what we should be putting our like eyes on, what we should be like tilting our ears towards. And so like it is hard to know what you desire when you are surrounded by the desires of capitalism, of patriarchy,
right, where we're told what we should
desire. Exactly. So I think part of it is like, at least for me, is like starting with that silence and like helping folks just come back to their body and their breath. I think that moment with your body, even just like a 5-minute pause, is a touchstone. It's like, oh yeah, I exist, yes, within all of it, but I also exist apart from it. And there's an opportunity for me to like be with myself, with spirit, in a way that is an opening rather than like a shutting down. Because I think, the way that everything is like a lot of our bodies are shutting down. So that, I think that's the first thing that I do with folks, is just like creating that space for like settling. That is just, I think, like like I shared a little bit, like our stories are just, they're really, really deep. And sometimes we don't know how deep they go. So I think just curiosity, asking folks questions about, starting with where they are today, and then noticing something subtle. It's usually what happens when I'm sitting with someone is like they'll say something that is like an offhand comment, but I think oftentimes our offhand comments are like the thing they were hoping someone picks up on.
Yeah.
Subconsciously, unconsciously. And so that's usually a thing where I'm like, oh, that's really interesting that you said that, or that you alluded to this thing. Tell me more. Tell me more about that. And I think people know themselves, like, I don't think. I know people know themselves more than they think they do. And so a lot of times what I do is just to hold up a mirror to say, you know you. Like, you can listen to yourself. You can trust yourself because you know you. Like, I don't know your story, you know your story. You've lived your story. And so what in your story is stuck? Like, what in your story, I don't see my work as a spiritual director, as a companion. It's not a role of like telling. It's more just a role of like observing, mirroring, saying, this is what you're saying. This is what you're holding. Is this true? Is this what you believe? Is this what you want? And I think it returns the power to the person. I think that's also part of like the world that we live in, is like we have given our power away to different systems, to different institutions. We've allowed authorities to just dictate how we are meant to like live and work and be in relationship, and so I want people to know that their story is like that place of transformation.
I wonder with storytelling how that connects to the decolonial. And I know you to be somebody through our relationship, and also folks can read more about this in your bio, which we'll include in the show notes. But you're so rooted in decoloniality and this deep commitment to untangling those stories that colonialism has taught us about who we are. And so I'm curious in the storytelling process, what how decoloniality is woven through that, as I know it is for you, but for our listeners to understand like how that informs that work of storytelling and story listening.
I think, when I think about colonialism, I think about powers coming into a story and distorting it and saying, this is wrong, this is evil, this shouldn't exist. This lineage is wrong. Colonialism is just like, we have the best story. Our story is the right one. Our story is superior to any other story that exists. And so, and also, if you don't abide by our story, well, then like you're gone. You don't deserve to exist. So, like for me, like story is like this way of some covering like what's the lie and what's the truth. Colonialism is insidious. Like it gets into our bodies, into our minds, into our spirits. Like we're not even conscious of it, And so to like be in story, to be with story, is to like start to kind of like unfold that and say, okay, like actually like this is keeping me in depth. This is keeping me in disconnection. This is keeping me in greed and exploitation, and it's also a place to say, this is what's drawing me towards life. This is what's drawing me towards, I can't think of anything other than life, like that's it, like into like what's generative, into like what is like rich soil that can like, that's fertile, like what in your story is like going to, again, is going to like hold up the mirror and say like, this is true and this is not true. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what's flowing with me today.
I love the idea of being attentive to life and how expansive that is, that it's not just about one's own life or even about other people. It's also about all beings and all that makes life possible. And so it's a really generous way to inhabit our story, to be oriented toward life. I often think about in my work, both as church planting priest and as writer, as mother, and all these vocations that I inhabit as spouse, what is it that wants to live here? And it's not my job to force something to grow. Like I actually don't produce the growth itself. That's not what I am capable of doing. But I can nurture and I can pay attention and care and offer love and offer support. To build trellises around the plants that already are growing. And to also root out weeds, perhaps, to keep the metaphor going. But that feels like a really nourishing image and invitation to pay attention to life in our stories. Like, what is bringing death, and what is what are the sources of power over that are stories of domination and of shame, and then what are the stories that are about flourishing. That feels really freeing.
Yeah, as you're talking, just also like reflecting on the spirality. I don't know if that's a word. The spiraling nature of that story, right? Like at another moment in my life, I was very consumed with time, and just like the ways that we like conceptualize of time, and just how like thinking about time as linear. Also kind of keeps us in a colonial mindset. Does it create space for us to like return into the story?
Right.
And so like moving towards like circularity, moving towards like spiraling is I think like how we do that uncovering, is like how we move towards that flourishing, because it's just like, oh, like I'm not either at point A or point B. It's like I am point A, and then I'm also point B, and like those two things actually don't exist as separate. They're like this. There's something else there, but my brain's a little tired, so.
Well, now I'm super curious to ask you what you make of this story that time is money that people always throw around.
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. Well, I think that's just, I think it's a story. I think it's a story of capitalism. It's a story of colonialism. Like, stories are just going to exist. And I think that's what I keep saying is like, it's part of our responsibility to be looking at the stories that we've inherited. Because I imagine that there are some people for whom like time is money might mean when I devote myself to a project or a process, it brings me abundance. I think that's a way of saying time is money, It's said differently, but...
It's kind of the inverse of what people usually mean when they use that phrase.
Right. So I think what I'm trying to say is like the story like the words in a story in and of themselves aren't like right or wrong. It's just like how we choose to like step into the story. And so like time is money from a capitalistic lens is like, well, I gotta hustle, like the more I hustle, the more I'm productive, the more I can extract, the more I can, amass just for myself.
How much money can I squeeze out of this hour?
Exactly. But I don't know if that's necessarily the only way of like holding that story. Yeah, you're making me think. Like, I think what I said is like, my devotion to my process, like time. my devotion to the spiral, my devotion to my commitment to showing up to my story through time, it will equal some kind of life and abundance. It will equal some kind of wealth. Whether that's like wealth of relationship, whether that's like wealth of relationship to land. And I say that because I think it's, again, like it's just always trying to disrupt that like binary, right? Of like, that's a bad story. Time is money is a bad story. Well, it's like, it is also sometimes like the way that we choose to like look at the story can maybe make it a little bit more expansive or redeems it in some way, you know? Like, I think our stories aren't static. Like there's always a way to move a story into, like we said, into life, into flourishing.
Yeah, that's helpful because it's not like we snap our fingers and suddenly our minds are erased and we end up teleported into a different dimension where we're suddenly divorced from all that came before us. You know, all of our history, all of our collective history and experiences, being able to have, these processes that help us transform the stories that we tell and reclaim and renew and resurrect them in ways that are generative. That feels really helpful. And it's that portal space that you've talked about where we can do that transforming, alchemizing work.
Yeah, I do think in that portal, like time takes on it is just different. I don't know. For you, when you were pregnant, like it just, I think there's moments in our lives where like time, it contracts and it expands. And like, it's both in this moment and it's also like in another moment. And I don't really have, like, I don't have real language to describe that just because it's so, sometimes I get into my little abstract thoughts and, but I do think there's something there, you know.
I wonder if there's a word of hope that you might want to give our listeners or what's making you hopeful when it comes to the work that you're doing right now, the world that we're in, this portal that we all find ourselves in right now.
One of the things I wrote on social media the other day, and I think this is true for lots of areas of our lives, you know, relationally, financially, spiritually, is like where we are today is not where we have to be tomorrow. There's always a potentiality in the day that we have. There's always a possibility in the day that we have. That transformative potential exists in every moment. And so, you know, when we're ready to step into a new story, it's going to be there to meet us. And I think that's, you know, spirit and story and like self, like it's not coercive, right? So we're not being like forced to meet the newness. But the invitation's always there if and when we're ready to step into it. Yeah.
Well, that's a really lovely note to go out on. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and being here on the podcast today.
Thanks, Lauren. So happy to join you.